The following program is made possible by the generous support of these sponsors. United Bank, with full-service banking for our community and our veterans from convenient locations. By PGBA, the healthcare claims processor for the American Armed Forces, serving those who serve us. And by Conway Ford, dedicated to serving our communities and our veterans in Horry, Georgetown, and Marion counties. From the campus of Coastal Carolina University, the Center for Military and Veteran Studies is pleased to present Military Memoirs. Hello and welcome to Military Memoirs. I'm Rod Gregg, and our guest for this program today is Colonel David S. Jones, United States Army, served as an artillery officer, a long and distinguished career, and then in the military intelligence. It's a pleasure, sir, to have you here.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.
So, how in the world did you get first interested in serving in the military?
Well, it wasn't hard. I had a father that had served in the Army, and lots of uncles that had served in the Army, and one that was in the Navy. And as a young boy growing up, just being near them and wanting to be a part of what I sensed as a family tradition, that steered me in that direction. And then my father also was very encouraging about history in general. My brother and I, at a very young age, were Civil War reenactors. And I think the only reason we pulled that off was because we had a father that facilitated it. When we were the two guys sitting out under a canvas tarp getting soaked, sleeping in the rain, my father would be in the camper, over in the right place, staying warm and dry. So those things, just the sense of appreciation of history, and then what I saw as a tradition within the family of service, whether it was going to be the Army or some other service, not necessarily, was really what helped motivate me. And then the biggest piece was probably my brother, who's 5 years older than me. In a lot of ways, I just followed his footsteps. He went off to college, did ROTC at Johns Hopkins, and I remember when I went to his commissioning event, the professor of military science did the old proverbial, "Well, young man, what are you going to do with your life?" So I actually ended up following him and going to Johns Hopkins ROTC as well.
Did that career in the military work out as you thought it might as a child, or was it a surprise?
Well, as a child, I could never have imagined what it meant. And I think, like a lot of folks that enter the service, when you first enter, I think very few enter the service already thinking they're going to make a career of it. I believe a lot of folks come in saying, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do it for a period of time, and then I'll find out what's the next chapter. For me, I was very fortunate that the experiences were such that I never seriously thought of leaving it. Because again, I think it was a sense of service that was instilled. My brother and I, my father, we had gone through the Boy Scouts. So all those kind of things. I guess the way I would almost summarize it is, at least in Dave Jones's understanding of, I'm middle class America. I was brought up with a sense of service in a family that had done service, and the Boy Scouts reinforced that. My high school experience, be a football player, those things, it was all just part of how society helped build you into a citizen. And then once I was in the service, it was clear to me that this is my path, and I've had difficult times, but I've never had any regrets.
Well, a sense of service that you have is also a willingness to sacrifice. Have you ever been that point in your career where you thought, I might be making a big sacrifice?
Yes. I mean, again, there's difficult times that you experience, especially through combat and so forth. But I was blessed in the fact that I married a fellow soldier, and she also had that same sense of service. And when it came time to pack the family up and move, yeah, some folks would say, what, you want me to move away from my rest of my family and go overseas? Might find that difficult, but for us, we saw it as an adventure. And our daughters were introduced to that, so they also don't know any other lifestyle other than, oh, it's time to move again. So let's pack up and move.
How and when and where did you enter the military?
Again, I followed my brother into Reserve Officer Training Corps at Johns Hopkins University, so that's in Baltimore, Maryland. And I was commissioned out of that detachment, and then immediately went out to Fort Sill, Oklahoma for officer basic course. So I guess I would say I signed on in the state of Maryland.
Yeah. So you did your basic, and then you found yourself at Fort Sill, and moved into armor?
Well, field artillery.
Artillery. Right.
So as I said earlier, followed my brother's footsteps. My brother was commissioned as a field artillery officer. So I went out to Fort Sill just like he did. I looked at the other branches, but for some reason it was just something based on some of what I'd heard from my brother. So I took that branch, went out there, and President Reagan was in office at the time. Cold War was in full bloom. We had 250,000 troops in West Germany at the time. And my ROTC detachment, almost to the person, every one of us said, we'd like to go to Europe. So I was very fortunate that I was able to request assignment to the 1st Armored Division in Bavaria, Germany, and got my first preference. And
well, we kind of forget, look easily maybe, looking back, we civilians. But when you're in Germany at that time, I mean, the idea that there could be a division of Soviet tanks rolling down the Autobahn from East Germany into West Germany was very real. And was that on your mind?
It was. Once you've settled in over there, first of all, once you get past the first initial shock of being a young lieutenant, that I had never visited Europe before. So I show up and settle in, and you start learning your job. But you're already in a place where there's already an established standard of how we would do alerts and how we would roll out. So one of the things you're introduced to, and this, oddly enough, to this day, when I visit the U.S. Army Museum that's now at Fort Belvoir in Virginia, they have a Cold War section. And in that Cold War section, they have a piece about Lariat Advance and the alert process in Western Europe, had there ever been a kickoff.
You want to explain that term?
That was the term that when you were at home and you were sleeping in your bed, and if your phone rang at 4 o'clock in the morning, you would pick your phone up, and the only thing you would hear was somebody in the call chain would say Lariat Advance. And Lariat Advance was understood to be the word that told you, get in right now, draw your gear, and await instructions. And those instructions would sometimes leave you in garrison, or those instructions would deploy you out to a local training area, or those instructions would send you all the way out to your general defensive positions, which was known as a GDP. But it all started with just those two words, Lariat Advance. So anybody that ever served in Europe during any period of the Cold War, again, your hair kind of stands on the back of your neck when you hear Lariat Advance, because that's what came down. And then you had a phone tree. So as Second Lieutenant Jones that had, a staff sergeant and other enlisted men underneath him, I would then take that phone, dial the next number, staff sergeant would pick up, and I'd say Lariat Advance. And that would be the phrase that would go through the phone tree, and everybody had a certain amount of time, and we'd all be back on post. A lot of the troops were already on post. So by the time I normally arrived on post, most of the armored vehicles were loaded up, engines were cranked, rolling over. As a lieutenant, you were normally then, you would go off, huddle with the captain. Captain would say, okay, it looks like this one is going to take us out to the local training area. And you'd be out there, the sun would come up, and of course everybody's like, when am I going to get some food? What are we doing? Are we going on? But you went out with the bags and equipment and everything, that if you were literally told this is it, You would stop somewhere up in your general defensive positions and you wouldn't come home again.
Right, and you didn't know when you went whether
Right.
it was a drill or whether it was real.
And I was in that environment when the wall fell, and there was a lot of speculation of, okay, how are the Soviets going to respond to the fact that this Warsaw Pact is falling apart on them?
Well, and you had a coup, an attempted coup in the Soviet Union. I mean, all of that could have been.
So it was interesting times, and as a young lieutenant, it was exciting times. And quite frankly, it's really not till years later that you think back of, okay, if this thing had actually happened, this is what would have happened. Now, as a field artillery officer, I not only served with armor battalions as a fire support officer, but I served in a 155 self-propelled artillery battalion. And that artillery battalion was, like many of them, were nuclear capable. So you went through the instruction of how would you deliver a 155 nuclear round in the event of a general war.
Well, we don't think about in the civilian life, you don't think about the fact that they're nuclear artillery shells.
Right.
We think missiles, bombs, torpedoes, launch things, but yeah, they're out there, right?
But you don't ever think that there would be a time where a second lieutenant would be in a position of authority to say, pull that lanyard, and someone's going to be launching a artillery nuclear round. And quite frankly, it's not till years, if not decades later, that, you know, when I'm sitting there thinking, would have been a pretty bad scenario if the day ever came that Second Lieutenant Jones was drawing one of those.
Well, the training, hopefully, is such that a second lieutenant, even if he's not, second lieutenant, especially if he's not like you, is taking that very seriously.
It's all about the training, you're right. Because regardless of whether that war had ever gone nuclear or not, that was going to be a vicious fight. And everybody understood that.
Well, thankfully, we didn't go to a shooting war in Europe, but we had other places and other times, and you were at several of those. We're going to talk about that when we come back in just a moment.
Military Memoirs is produced by the United Bank Center for Military and Veteran Studies at Coastal Carolina University and is made possible in part by the Lieutenant Tab Stogner Horry County Veterans Oral History Project, which is named in honor of the late H. Otis Tab Stogner, Jr., a World War II veteran of the United States Army. The project records and preserves oral history with Horry County veterans.
They're all around us. They're the men and women who served in our nation's armed forces. In good times and bad, they've been willing to stand in harm's way to preserve, protect, and defend the legacy of freedom we enjoy as Americans. All of them gave some, and some of them gave all. We owe them a lot. So the next time you see an American veteran, say thank you for all of us.
The United Bank Center for Military and Veteran Studies preserves oral history from American veterans of all service branches, including the U.S. Coast Guard. The Hack Mintz U.S. Coast Guard Oral History Project is named in honor of the late Henry Hack Mintz, a longtime resident of Myrtle Beach who held 3 U.S. Coast Guard commands. The Hack Mintz U.S. Coast Guard Oral History Project, a key component of the United Bank Center for Military and Veteran Studies.
And welcome back to Military Memoirs. I'm Rod Gregg, and talking to Colonel David S. Jones, retired artillery officer, armor officer, intelligence officer, who is still working as a consultant in the field, and it's a pleasure to have you here with us.
Thank you.
So you did combat tours. What was your first one?
My first combat tour was Desert Storm, so 1990-91.
First Persian Gulf War.
Yes, sir.
What was your closest call?
Well, I was a battalion fire support officer for a M1 tank battalion, 470 Armor out of 1st Armored Division. So we crossed the Saudi Arabia-Iraqi border, crossed the berm, following 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment units. The battalion that I was in was the furthest western battalion, so we sat on the Corps boundary. So there was always a lot of concern of potentially putting artillery fire across the Corps boundary and misidentifying friendly units that would be on the other side. So as the battalion fire support officer, that was my number one concern, that we would ever put fires down on friendly forces, and friendly fires is always continued to be a challenge. So it was a 100-hour war, and we pretty much moved most all of that 100 hours. And when we came up on our first engagement in a Iraqi town called Al-Basaya, it was a fairly clean-cut fight. Went through the Iraqi forces very quickly with the infantry forces that we had in Bradley's. So we moved beyond that, and other than some other small engagements, the big fight for the 2nd Brigade of 1st Armored Division was what's known as the Battle of Medina Ridge. And again, 470 Armor was the left flank of the brigade when we had that fight. And at one point we had artillery rounds coming in across the battalion and impacting. And I remember the battalion commander coming across the radio asking, "Is that ours or theirs?" And of course, as the artillery officer, I very quickly confirmed that it was enemy fire that was coming in. But that was the most significant, along with 73 Easting, that was the most significant armor fight that occurred. And when we first ran up against the dug-in Iraqi T-72s,
tanks,
T-72 tanks, there was a little bit of surprise of running up against them, because although we mostly envisioned deserts as being pretty much flat as a board, there is enough undulating terrain that when you kind of crest something and you see a row of tanks ahead of you. So initially, the M1s, the battalion backed away to a safe distance where we could first put artillery fires on them, and just the incredible range that the M1 120 millimeter gun had made it to where we were able to engage their tanks, but they were not able to range us.
They were really outclassed.
They were outclassed, and by that point they had been pummeled for weeks as a result of the air war. But as I said earlier, that was really the moment when I think you could say that everything all of us had trained on, whether it was in my case with only a couple of, three years in the Army, or a battalion commander who had 20 years in the Army, just everybody really validated our training and our equipment, that we had superior equipment, and we had superior tactics, and we had superior leadership.
So you really have to have, for success, weaponry and training.
Yes. And the leadership to use it.
And leadership, exactly.
And those three really made that a one-sided fight, which, let's all be honest, if you're going to have to fight a war, that's how you want it to be. Okay, it is about coming in with overwhelming force and deciding the matter as quickly as humanly possible, because time will only cost more lives. So for me as a young lieutenant, that validated everything that I had experienced in my career up to that point. And although there were times during that fight where rounds were coming in, whether it was just a factor of being a first lieutenant or being surrounded by a whole lot of armor, you didn't feel the threat that you would perhaps feel in other environments, because it was just such an outstanding unit that was continuously on the attack. And other than the concern of us having any friendly fire incidences, we both with our 4 deuce mortars and with our 155 artillery put very effective fires, along with the help of A-10s from the Air Force, to where it was just a devastating impact on the enemy. Well,
that close air support from those A-10 aircraft,
yes,
really important.
Absolutely crucial. The ALO, the Air Liaison Officer that sat in the 113 with me, was actually a F-16 pilot that had been pulled from Shaw Air Force Base, South Carolina. So anytime a jet flew over, you could just see him grit his jaws that he felt he should be up there.
It's going to be hard for an Air Force.
But once he got past that, we had an incredible teamwork that was going to where, for example, if he had some A-10s loitering that just ready, and we had a target, I would be able to call in white phosphorus rounds as marker rounds, and then he would orient the A-10s off those rounds to where they would come in and do gun runs.
History of American Armed Forces is that outproduced and outclassed and outtrained and excellent leadership. So are we able to keep that up now, you think?
Well, since then we've had the traditional peaks and valleys that we go through. With the end of the Cold War, we went into another drawdown period. We also, as is very common within the military, we learn to fight one particular type of war, only to then have that wrap up, and now it's like, okay, how do you prepare for the next war? Because as the saying goes, you don't want to fight your last war. Again, you've got to adapt your tactics. So I would tell you that the Army puts a lot of effort into breaking that code of how do we depart from the tactics that were necessary to win in an insurgency, or however you like to categorize the fight in Afghanistan and Iraq, and how do you prepare for a peer fight should that day ever come.
Well, you also served intelligence officer, like a second career in the military, and you back in Iraq, and also at the DMZ, the demilitarized zone between South Korea and North Korea. What was that like?
Korea is a unique assignment by all means. Being in the division that was literally up against the DMZ, you understood that if a conflict had been initiated there, it was going to be a rough beginning. The North Koreans had an incredible, and still do, artillery and missile capability that could easily range down to Seoul. So similar to my assignment in Germany, you understood you were initially in a defensive phase. How were we going to defend South Korea and absorb initial attacks by the North Koreans? And similar to the Soviet Warsaw Pact model, they were dependent upon quantity over quality. A massive force that was going to be coming down through the corridors out of North Korea.
Or through the air into Seoul. Through the air into Seoul.
Well, their ability to do insertion,
artillery,
and old Colt aircraft and stuff like that, yes, would drop folks in the back along the coasts. They would also do insertions, but it was understood that the quality of the force that they were going to be pushing on the ground would be inferior. So it was a matter of how would we decisively engage that with a better trained, a better quality capability of our forces to stop that initial attack and then push them back. So as a young captain, that's what you trained for. You did lots of drills and what ifs. You spent a lot of time up in projected battle positions just to make sure that if the call ever came, we got there with all the equipment, we were ready to execute our mission. And to this day, I think we have an outstanding armed force that's on the peninsula with an outstanding ally with the South Koreans, and we'll be prepared.
Well, as an intelligence officer, you have trained a lot of allies, right?
I have. I've had the opportunity, allies and partners. So one of my last Iraq deployments, I trained the Iraqi Minister of Interior on how to better be able to secure their country. And equipped them, brought them in the capabilities to do the jobs that was necessary to do. And one of my most recent assignments, I had the opportunity to work with Baltic allies, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, as well as our partners in Ukraine, just to, again, share with them best practices and how to either better integrate and fight with NATO, or in the case of Ukraine, how better to just be able to defend their country, which we see that now playing out with the Russian invasion.
Do you see this combination that's so important of the training, the weaponry, and the leadership?
It is, because any one of those not being given the appropriate focus can undermine the other two. Equipment in this day and age of modern warfare you've got to have the best equipment, and you've got to know how to use it. I met some incredible leaders in these countries that I've trained in, especially in the Baltics. I mean, that's their home turf. They know it well, and they know exactly how they would defend it. All they wanted was some help with, equipping, let's share tactics. And in this day and age, we can actually learn from a number of our allies and partners. I saw that in Ukraine. The Ukrainians right now are learning incredibly valuable lessons that a lot of countries can learn from, NATO can learn from. So it's all a matter of how do we get that out so that we can get the benefit of the sacrifices and the fight that they're putting up right now, so that we, both as a country and as NATO, are a better trained, better prepared force in the future.
Well, you retired from the military in 2017, but immediately became a consultant with the Marine Corps, working in the Pentagon, elsewhere. Anything you'd like to say about what you're doing?
Well, I became a civilian employee. I was a Department of the Navy employee working with the United States Marine Corps. And coming out of 30 years in the Army, there are always those service rivalries. But I'll tell you what, I absolutely loved working with the Marines. Incredible motivation, incredible appreciation for their history. And a lot of that I felt I could share because of my time in the 2nd Infantry Division, which the Marines fought under in World War I, and my time in the 3rd Infantry Division, which fought with the Marines in Belleau Wood.
World War I, yeah.
In World War I. I did not miss the opportunity to make sure the Marines knew we were there with them. and also the solemn piece of just what Belleau Wood means to the Marines, and the historical impact of the modern Marine Corps we see in its roots going back to Belleau Wood. I mean, there was a time when the Marines would have perhaps not been deployed in World War I were it not for the efforts of the Commandant, and you would probably see a very different Marine Corps today had they not had that chance to go over there and show, hey, we can fight a modern fight.
We don't have to have
We're
water.
not only sea soldiers, but we're also quite capable of fighting a modern war in a place like Europe. So really enjoyed that, and the motivation that they brought to the training that we did. Again, the training I did with the Ukrainians and Baltic countries was all with Marines. I would go in there, help do the initial discussions, set things up, set curriculums, but it was Marines that came in and that did the training. And I'll tell you what, just to see the response from our allies and partners when they see a Marine in that uniform and with that attitude come in was inspiring.
And that's
so it was great. So really
that's important.
Appreciate it that time, but most importantly, I think to the part that the Marines helped work with the Ukrainians, we're seeing the results of that with a Ukraine that's capable of going toe-to-toe with the current fight.
And defending itself.
Yeah.
Well, you, along the way, you married an Army officer, Captain Lisa Kessner, and you have 2 daughters, and you're still at work, and will soon be off across the water doing other things.
Going back to Germany to do the same, yes.
Yeah, so thank you so much for your service. Thank you for not just what you've done, but what you're willing to do. And thank you for being on this program with us.
Well, thank you for this opportunity to be on your program, but more importantly than that, thank you for having a program that helps get this out to our society. My father's generation grew up at a time when a large portion of our population had served, and that is no longer the case. It is a very small fraction of our society that serves now. So to be able to get this out to that population is very valuable, so thank you.
Well, you're welcome, and all of you in uniform take good care of us. We appreciate it. We appreciate you two being with us for Military Memoirs.
The preceding program is made possible by the generous support of these sponsors. Conway Ford, dedicated to serving our communities and our veterans in Horry, Georgetown, and Marion counties. By PGBA, the health claims processor for the American Armed Forces, serving those who serve us. And by United Bank, with full-service banking for our community and our veterans from convenient locations.